Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk, and thank the organizers of the UNNC Gender Studies Conference for inviting me to deliver this talk. Sorry I can't be here with you in Ningbo today, although I would very much love to do so because of the work commitment in Nottingham, as well as, of course, the long distance and other reasons. Today, I'm going to talk about my new book, which is called Contemporary Chinese Queer Performance, published by Routledge last year in 2022. I'm going to show you some pictures and film clips. I understand that not everyone has the opportunity to see a queer performance. So hopefully those pictures and film clips will help you get an understanding of what are queer performances and what has happened in China during the past 2 decades. I'm now going to share the screen. I hope you can see my screen at the moment. So a little bit of history about this book. So this is my fourth book, or my recent book in the Queer Chinese series. I'm a cultural historian, so my full-time job is, as a researcher, is to document China's queer history from the 1990s to present, when gay identity and communities emerged in urban China, and what kind of cultural history has it produced. For example, film, television, art, theater, literature, and so on and so forth. So my first book is called Queer Comrades, Gay Identity and Tongzhi Activism in Post-Socialist China. And that book was my PhD thesis, or was based on my PhD thesis. So essentially in that book, I focused on this notion of tongzhi, or comrade, how the term evolved from a kind of socialist comrade term to the post-socialist term for LGBTQ plus people. So essentially, it's about the genealogy of the term as well as the history associated with it and what the term enables. The term can be seen as a politicized gay identity. So what kind of activism does that identity enable? So that's the first book, Queer Comrades. And after that, that is followed by the second book, Queer China, Lesbian and Gay Literature and Visual Culture under Post-Socialism. So in this book, I, of course, focus on literary and cultural productions in the queer communities. In particular, I highlight the role of culture, or what I call cultural activism, in enabling the articulation of queer identities and communities. And then this is followed by the third book, Queer Media in China. So I'm situated in a department of media and cultural studies. So obviously media is an important form where queer people engage with their identities and communities and activism. So in this book, I'm focusing on what I call community media, or queer community media, which differs from the mainstream political media or the commercial media or social media that we see today, because queer community media targets the community. It has a very narrow niche. Some people say it's a kind of narrow casting instead of broadcasting. So type of media produced for the queer community inevitably have its own features. So that's the remit of the book, Queer Media in China. And after that, my focus has shifted to theater and performance. This is because of many reasons. I used to work in a theater academy, so that's why that I'm interested in contemporary forms of theater and performance, such as avant-garde theater and Peking opera, and so on and so forth. So, but there is also another epistemological reason which I'm interested in, which is I use this book to explore how to write about queer identity and culture away from textual analysis, or not simply limited to textual analysis. So theater and performance is a great, in a way, avenue for this. This is because for theater and performance, you need space, you need people, you need all the tools and technologies, and you also need the audience. So the whole scenario is very interactive. It is an embodied and affective way of engagement, engaging with the theater industry, engaging with the audience, engaging with the social. So that's what I see as a perfect opportunity to go beyond the cultural text. So as cultural studies scholars, we are familiar with textual analysis, but text can only do so much. And there's a lot that is out of the text that should be paid attention to. So that's the kind of motive for me to write this book, by tracing the kind of social engagement of theater and performance. I hope to look at the kind of embodied and affective and social dimensions of queer culture and activism. So in a way, it's both a contribution to queer studies and a contribution to theater and performance studies, bring the two fields together, and by situating them in a Chinese context, and look at some of the ramifications brought about by the particular situations of China. So, sorry. Next one. So a natural question to ask when it comes to such a topic is, what is Chinese queer performance? So an even more crucial question to ask is, where can we find Chinese queer performance? And of course, I can give you many examples and many reasons. Here are a few possible answers. So you can find queer performance in Chinese opera, such as Peking opera, Kunqu opera, or Yue opera. And in those opera performances, there is a lot of gender crossing element. So, for example, the Dan role in Peking opera is a great example of the kind of transgender cross-dressing performance. But this is more than that, because if you're familiar with China's theater history, you know that there's a very strong history of homoeroticism in China's theater history. If you're familiar with the film 霸王别姬 or Farewell My Concubine, and you know that there is this hidden history together with China's theater reform, this history of homoeroticism was also erased at the beginning of the People's Republic. And apart from traditional theater and operas, you can also find contemporary forms of queer performance, such as drag shows. In places such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, you can find this RuPaul type of drag performance, and sometimes with a kind of a local variance, which I find very fascinating. And there are also gay weddings. So some of the gay weddings are real weddings, others are fake weddings. When I say fake weddings, I mean that they are actually performance artworks aimed at changing the society or inviting the audience to reflect upon the normativity of the heterosexual weddings. So for example, the pictures I'm showing here is taken from a performance artwork called 新前门大街, New Beijing New Marriages. So which is basically Fan Popo's activist video based on a flash mob type of activism. I'm going to talk more about this example in a minute, but suffice to say that weddings, be it true or false, be it fake or authentic, has a very strong performative element. And of course, by performance, we're not simply talking about artistic representation. We're also talking about this kind of social scripts. So everything we do is already a type of performance. So how I deliver a talk also has a very strong performative element in it. And of course, wedding rituals can be seen as a type of performance. And this theme has been extensively explored in artworks, films, and so on. So probably a lot of you may be familiar with Li An or An Li's film, The Wedding Banquet. There's a very strong performative element in it, and it's extremely queer as well. So if you're more familiar with popular culture, you might recognize some of those queer celebrities in the Chinese language world, such as Leslie Chang, Jin Xing, and so on. So these are considered to be queer icons, and those queer icons usually will perform on stage or in media. So they play a very important role in a way, informing the audiences about what is queer. And of course, in a lot of mainstream, in a way, talk shows or reality shows, you see those kind of queer figures. What's a paradox, or what's paradoxical about Chinese media is that although LGBTQ identities are so-called banned or censored on media, queer representations are ubiquitous on Chinese media. You just think about all those Danmei literature or Danmei drama, or a reality TV show like 超级女声, 中国好声音, and so on. You see so many queer characters. They're not identified as such, but the audience can easily recognize them, or the audience can come up with a queer reading them queerly. So this is quite fascinating. So the next question that I ask is that what is queer? Is there queer in China today? And of course, when we talk about queer, there are more than one word. There are terms such as 同志, comrade, 同性恋, homosexual, 酷儿, queer, gay, LGBT, LGBTQ, SOGI, and so on. So those terms denoting gender and sexual identities and desires coexist in contemporary China, so revealing the complexity of sexual desires and identities in the contemporary Chinese context. But the term queer do exist. So the term queer was originally translated by Taiwanese scholars. So to translate the term queer, so using the word 酷儿, and then the term was basically introduced to other Chinese contexts, such as by Beijing Queer Film Festival, Shanghai Queer Film Festival, and Li Yinghe's book published in 2000 called 酷儿理论, and so on. So suffice to say that now queer has become a more accepted term in Chinese society, especially in art and academic circles. So when people talk about queer, it usually carries certain associations. For example, young people would see it as the kind of manifestation of a cool lifestyle and a fashionable identity. And academics would see the term queer as a subversion of gender and sexual norms. So the queer does have a life in China, although it may not be the same as its, well, in a way, its origins or the Western sense of the word, but which is perfectly fine. So this is a case with cultural translation. You gain more interesting things as you lose some of the baggages. Okay, so what is queer performance? So this is actually more in the realm of theater and performance studies, but suffice to say that theater and performance studies, in particular in the Chinese context, is very much influenced by either the Chinese opera type of performance or the Stanislavski type of training, which I call the mimetic model, which really models on the social realities. However, theater does not have to directly correspond with social realities. Theater and performance usually does more. So we are really talking about a type of post-dramatic, or people would call avant-garde type of theater, which may or may not represent reality directly. So when when scholars talk about queer dramaturgy, they are using queer dramaturgy as a kind of disruptive mode in order to challenge the heteronormative notions of conventional theater. And of course, there is such a small field called queer performance studies. Remember that I'm not talking about theater studies. So theater studies and performance studies overlap a lot, but they are also different. Performance is really a broader concept which encompasses theater, but is more than theater. So for queer performance studies, most of the publications so far have focused on the Western context, Europe, America, UK, and so on. So there are not many books written about Asia. So the book, Contemporary Chinese Queer Performance, is really the first book dedicated to the study on the topic. But being the first book, there are pros and cons. Its pros is that you can write about anything that you want because nobody has written on the topic before. But of course, the weakness is that it's difficult to find materials. So for those who are familiar with theater and performance, you know that you have to be on the spot to see things, to experience things. So simply reading a theater text is far from enough as far as experience is concerned. But of course, I have attended some performances when I did conducting my field work in China before the pandemic. But the writing of this book partly overlapped also with the pandemic, which means that most of the time I have to interview theater makers or performance artists, etc. And I have to watch videos. And that has its own advantages and disadvantages. One advantage is that I was able to pay more attention to digital performances or online performances during the pandemic. So one of the chapters is dedicated to the study of the kind of queer diaspora performance during the pandemic, which is how Chinese artists based in Europe use performance, especially online performance, to conduct activism. So overall, this book examines different types of performance. When I say performance, it's a broad term. It includes theater. It also includes performance art. It even includes photography and films, which I'm going to explain why in a minute. But it covers a variety of cultural forms. The methodology ranges from, for example, textual analysis of theater text to ethnography in those performance events, to interviews with theater makers and performance artists and so on, and a little bit archival research as well. So that's the background of this research. So let me show you actually a table of content of the book before I delve into some of the examples. So the book is divided into 3 sections. The part 1 is called Performing Queer Memory. So this section is interesting because it is about past queer events and histories and memories, but it's also dealing with unusual subjects such as photography. So for those who are familiar with China's art history, Renhang is a very famous, internationally known, was an international known queer artist who committed suicide a few years ago. So it is very atypical to treat photography as a type of performance. But if you think about what photography involves people's intentional display of their bodies. You have to smile to the camera, say cheese or 茄子. You have to appear happy and so on. You have to arrange your background carefully. So there's a very strong performance element in photography. So that's why that I'm dealing with photography as a type of performance. And the second chapter is about cinema. The film, of course, has a performance element because there are actors, actresses, and so on and so forth. So that's relatively easy to understand. Section 2, mediating queer activism, looks at two instances of queer activism represented by Beijing Queer Chorus, which is a kind of queer choir musical performance. And then Fan Popo's documentaries, in which I examined some of the Fan's documentaries, and in particular, how he uses performance in tandem with documentary filmmaking to articulate queer activism. And then the last section deals with intercultural communication. So I look at actually 3 theater performances in a kind of more conventional sense. So there is this East Palace, West Palace theater performance. There's also a documentary theater form called About My Parents and Their Child. And the last chapter deals with digital performances during the COVID period. So that's basically the last section. What's interesting about the last section is that they are all set in a transnational context, dealing with different countries and cultures in which queer design is treated differently and became an mediating factor. So let me show you some examples of queer performance. So the first example is the artist Ren Hang. So Ren Hang committed suicide, as I mentioned, in 2017. He was a genius photographer, and most of his photos deal with human nudity, but he portrays human nudity in a kind of beautiful and artistic way. So usually he arranges body in such a way that it defies identitarian terms or claims. So nobody knows whether the characters are sorry about my cold, a gay or lesbian. However, their intimacy is really demonstrated through this kind of enactment of the body. That's Ren Hang's photography. In chapter 2, I look at 2 examples, 2 films. The first film is the one on the right-hand side, Lan Yu. Many of you may be familiar with. The film was roughly based on the online fiction called 北京故事, Beijing Story. And then I also juxtapose it with a German film called Coming Out. What's interesting about those 2 films is that they both deal with the issue of coming out. And of course, come out, which means to confess to other people that one is gay, involves a lot of performance, and the historical and social and familial context often shape how one comes out and if one should come out at all. So it is a performative act. So the next example is Beijing Queer Chorus, which is one of the queer choirs in Chinese cities. So the queer choir has about 40 or 50 core members, and they usually put on performances in community spaces, bookshops, and sometimes small theaters. They often sing already known songs But sometimes they also create their own music and create their own songs to express issues within the queer community. And the example that I'm going to show you is a kind of originally proposed music for and by Beijing Queer Chorus. It is called, the next one, 郭浩然我问你能不能改. So 郭浩然 just tell me if you can change. So a bit of background is important. So this is a type of hybrid performance with digital performance, theater performance, and of course, documentary performance. What's interesting about this is that it takes a very important theme for queer communities, which is a queer relationship with their parents. Every Chinese New Year is considered to be a happy season, but not necessarily for many queer people, because when they go back home to their hometown, everybody will nag towards them saying, oh, when are you going to be married? Shall I introduce you a girlfriend or boyfriend, etc.? So this would become a burden for many queer people. So this musical performance focuses on the issue of queer people's relationship with their family during the Chinese New Year season. So before I play the video, let me double check that the sound is included. Okay, so sharing sound. Okay, so hopefully you'll be able to see and hear the performance.
包浩然，包浩然，过来玩会儿。
怎么了？这么没精打采的？
没事儿，就是本来都是跟家里人一起打麻将的，这不今年因为疫情又没回去，而且本来打算今年回去跟他们出柜。
这种事儿以后有的是机会。
就是先过年呗，以后事以后再说嘛。
也是，怕回去一说，估计又是一场狂风暴雨。
哎，郭浩然，上回你妈给你介绍那姑娘，你觉得怎么样啊？
不太合适啊。
你是不是没好好跟人家接触呀？
哎妈，真的没有感觉。
感觉？都多大了还讲感觉？我跟你说，人家那姑娘也在北京工作呢，还是人大毕业的呢，而且性格还特别好。
那咱们过年应该请他们家吃顿
饭。爸妈，我其实一直都喜欢男生。
不好让你呀，真心真心想起我，你呀，真心真心想起我。当年咱是一无自认，不说他到年份年长河。最近最近最近，你相亲相亲相亲相亲有点多，有些压力。 我能理解你找的借口可过分了。闭嘴，再说你咬你耳朵。闭嘴，再说咬你耳朵。老子养你20多年，没看出你想法这么邪恶。你从小明骂人也问，我肯定是那个臭流氓。 我没穿外套就往医院跑。
哆咪来哆啦哆嗦，
一则体温才30西，医生说比您温度低。
哆咪来哆啦嗦啦哆，哆咪来哆来，
14里数学考不好，
来哆啦哆来哆来，
我自学几何把你教。
哆咪来哆啦哆嗦，
给您做题儿一模底儿，比我还真没好哪儿去。
哆咪来哆啦嗦啦哆，哆咪来哆来，
21一出社会，
来哆啦哆来哆来，
我砸钱买了一辆 SUV，
哆咪来哆啦哆嗦，
车库埋在您楼下，没事就给您当司机。
哆咪来哆啦嗦啦哆，哆咪来哆来，
一片真心要为你好，
来哆啦哆来哆来，
到头来你说你并不需要。
哆咪来哆啦哆嗦，
真心我怎能改不到？只是真正的自己在手间。
手间哦。
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this musical performance performed by Beijing Queer Chorus. As you can see that the performance deal with some very specific queer issues, but it also actually will deal with some of the social issues, such as China's general relationship between Chinese families, different generations, and so on and so forth. So to perform this in front of the community and even in front of some parents, and this play or this performance really helps enhance intergenerational understandings. So in a way, it is a type of, it can be seen as a type of activism. So as the slogan of Beijing Queer Chorus goes, change the world gently with music. So the next example that I'm going to show is the kind of street performances, or some call flash mob type of performances. So the example that I'm going to draw on is from Fan Popo's documentary, which is based on a real life event from 2008 called 新前门大街. So the 新前门大街was a newly paved street after Beijing Olympics. As you can see, the title, New Beijing, New Marriage, was basically based on the slogan at that time, which is called New Beijing, New Olympics, I think. So what's interesting is that some activists from the LGBT groups put on this performance in public. It's a performance because the lesbian couples are not real couples and the gay couples are not real couples either. So they are just there for a short time, having this wedding photo shoot. And then it, in a way, attracts a lot of people's attention. And at the same time, they send flowers to passers-by, wishing them a happy Valentine's Day. And the Fan Popo and David Zheng at that time also interviewed some of the passerbys about their attitudes towards homosexuality and same-sex marriage. So this is in a way, film clip from that film.
这边那个男孩稍微看我一下，看一下镜头，脸稍微低一点。好。看着他好，好吧？对。等我啊，非常好。路人说了，看不出来是他们俩效果不错，看不出来。对，太过亲密。太恐怖了。
Okay, so that's a very short film clip, and you get the idea of the performance in public and the responses from the public towards this event. And of course, apart from these kind of public performances, there are also on-stage performance. So the picture on the left-hand side shows the Beijing performance of vagina monologues, and the one on the right-hand side shows a kind of community performance involving trans people. So the example that I'm going to show you first is the different renditions of vagina monologues in different Chinese cities. So starting from Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou, and then to Fudan University, and then Peking University. So it's a film trailer from Fan Popo's film of documentary also of China monologues documenting the three performances. So from the very beginning.
再说
你们一起和我说阴道，阴道。
阴道，我说出来了。阴道，我要大声说。
就会记得
阴道，
阴道。
我们说的太少了。很多器官都不常说，但是阴道。
Okay, so those are the three renditions or editions of vagina performance in China. And the next example, Fan Popo as a filmmaker is known for his queer children trilogies in which he documents the queer parents' relationship with their children. So his most famous work is called Mama Rainbow. And after Mama Rainbow, lots of audience members ask, where are dads? 爸爸你去哪里了? And so on. So Popo made a film called Papa Rainbow. But the making of Papa Rainbow wasn't that easy because a lot of dads were not comfortable to talk about their feelings. So in order to break the stereotypes and inhibition, Fan Popo organized, of course with the help of local organizations, organized a theater performance. So involving those dads in performing a theater. And this is called forum theater, informed by theater of the oppressed. So essentially, when the script has been performed once, the audience members can suggest alternative endings and so on and so forth. So I'll give you an idea of how this forum theater works.
你这个狗屁生活，这是中国，不是外国。你想干什么就干什么呀。
他在行为上，在生活习惯上，不太一样。
给我发去，去不去？
就是我所受的教育当中，这属于心理变态。
男朋友是啊，我喜欢男孩啊。你说说，是吗？孩子妈，我就喜欢带个媳妇儿回来吗？你给我滚！你现在给我滚！
Okay, as you can see that the dads were involved in the performance, and the audience were also actively involved in the performance. So the next example that I'm going to show you, as you can see, involves some BDSM element. This is because it is based on Wang Xiaobo's script, 东宫西宫, East Palace, West Palace. Most of you are probably more familiar with Zhang Yuan's film version, 1996 film, 东宫西宫, but this is a theater rendition that took place in Beijing in 2009. In a way, actually, it's a kind of minimalist theater, so involving very few people and stage props. So the alter ego of Alan appears on stage, and there is an interrogation scene. And it also draws on the conventional, traditional Chinese opera, 一桌二椅, the kind of one table, two chairs, stage props, and coupled by okay, so you get an idea of the kind of avant-garde aesthetics of that play. So the next example is a documentary theater called About My Parents and Their Child, in which parents and children have this intercultural and transmedia way of storytelling. For example, the dad's pictures were reflected on the son's t-shirt, and then the son talks to the dad, which presumably has passed away or didn't have opportunity to talk to each other. So the last set of examples that I'm going to share is during the pandemic. So a lot of artists based in, outside of China were using Zoom to perform their identities. And a lot of those performances involve the use of food. For example, Fan Po uses the kind of cooking scene in the kitchen to talk about issues such as xenophobia and anti-Asian racism. And Zheng Burong uses the kind of breakfast scene to talk about issues of connection and intimacy. So I gave you an idea of Zheng Burong's performance, and unfortunately the URL doesn't work, so I apologize for that. So now I'll draw a brief conclusion to my talk. So in a way, by bringing together all those different forms of performances, from photography to performance art to theater and digital performance, I hope to demonstrate that contemporary Chinese queer performance is transnational, transcultural, and transmedia, and they challenge fixed boundaries of identities, not only about sexual and gender identities, but also in terms of the boundaries between different media, art forms, and the state borders. Those performances also play a crucial role in constructing queer identities communities, and they function as a type of soft activism, so which is activism using culture to influence society, to, in a way, promote gender and sexual diversity in the Chinese context. So I'm currently working on another book, which is going to be published soon, actually, this summer, called Contemporary Chinese Queer Art. So this is a book that brings together many Chinese queer art, contemporary Chinese queer artists. In fact, I can show you this book. So this is a book. It's a very beautifully made book with many photo or colorful images, as you can see. So this book is a nice collection of queer art. And I'm also working on a couple of other projects, but here I'll just say that for those who are writing on Chinese genders and sexualities, please consider submitting your book proposals to this book series called Queer in China, Transnational Genders and Sexualities, co-edited by myself and Jamie Jing Zhao from Hong Kong City University, or City University of Hong Kong. So essentially, we're looking for monographs or edited collections. So if you have any questions, please feel free to visit the Bloomsbury website and follow the link and submit a book proposal. So we look forward to hearing from you. So that's all for my talk. And if the technology works okay, I'll be going online and have a live Q&A. Thanks very much.